Peace and power and elevation be to all you beautiful people out there. What's going on? What's happening? It's your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect. Live in effect. All right, so we still in the Black History Month, but you know, Black History is 365 days in a year. Okay? It's 365 days in a year. But I want to talk I have a question, actually. I have a question because maybe I can get some answer. What is the fascination behind Black folks want to be Native American? That's the topic for today. What is the fascination behind Black people wanting to be Native American? What's wrong with why? What's the big thing behind it? Because I see many people claim to be Indigenous. Then you got those who are Indigenous claim to be freemen. And then they try to rewrite history and try to say that slavery didn't happen. Then they make the argument that they people was already here in America. Well, how long ago was your people in America? How long ago are we speaking? Who were they? Are you sure they was African people? They claim that they people is indigenous to this land. How? How were they indigenous to this land? I just want to know, what is this big fascination behind being Native American? And then the funny part about it is the very same people who claim to be indigenous, they can't even tell you what language they speak. They can't even tell you what tribe they come from. Then when you ask them, okay, who in your family is Native American, right? I say, is it both sides of your family? They only could tell you it's one side of their family. They could tell you that it's their mother's side of the family that's Native American. I say, okay, what about your father's side? Or they might say their father's side of the family is Native American. They might say something about their great-great-grandmama or great-granddaddy is Native American. Okay, but what about everybody else? What is so hard about accepting your African heritage? That's what I'm trying to understand. What is so hard about that? Why can't you not accept that you are of African descent? Now, I'm not taking away the fact that there's people who don't have Native in them, because you do have Black people that got Native American in their family, especially if they live in certain areas or certain region. So, for example, if you live in certain part of Texas, Oklahoma, somewhere like that in Louisiana, you 9 times out of 10 you got Native American in you. Okay, I'm not arguing against that, but why do people have a hard time accepting the African part of them and just dealing with the Native American in them, or just want to claim to be 100% Native when you know you ain't? Is it a form of identity crisis? Is this a form of identity crisis? Is it a form of trying to be belonging to somewhere, be accepted into a culture? Because it's funny, the same people that talk about how they don't claim those African people don't accept them, but neither would these Native Americans want to accept you. You can't just jump into the Native American culture and say, hey, I'm Cherokee, I'm Choctaw, I'm Seminole, or whatever. You can't just say that. You have to show and prove. They're not just going to let you just come up in there into their culture. No. Brother Darren, peace to Brother Darren. He says, too many identity cults in the African American community, and the fact that African Americans are the most far removed diasporans from their African roots. Okay, that's an acceptable answer. Yes. Many are far removed from their African roots. Many. We see that. We see the crisis. So that's one of the reasons why, that could be one of the reasons why they jump on this Native American bandwagon. And y'all listen to people like Dane Calloway. This boy's a fraudulent. You can't. Boy, especially these celebrities, these black celebrities, especially, y'all, they are the most biggest target to these pseudos. I've noticed that a lot of these black celebrities are the biggest target to these pseudos. Like, these pseudos would know how to get to their pockets. They know how to talk a good game to them. And with these individuals who are big time stars, they don't have any form of knowledge or understanding. They go along with it like, oh yeah, you saying something deep, woo de woo de woo. And they giving away their money to these people. And don't realize that these folks represent the 10% that will rob your ass. So one thing I like about the nation of God's earth, right? They got orders of different type of people. You got the 85%ers, you got the 10%ers, and you got the 5%ers. So the 5%ers are those who know the truth, but they will be overlooked at and overheard. The 10%, they know the truth. However, they don't want to speak the truth to the people. So they're going to try to find ways to be manipulative to those who are at the 85%. And the 85% are those who don't know any better, who are very gullible, or who don't get it. And that's the case. So it's like, it seems like so many of them listen to what these pseudos have to say, and these pseudo folks tell you some stuff, and you jump on the bandwagon. You jump on this bandwagon with these people. You jump on the bandwagon, and you're not asking no questions. You're not even asking the right question. Well, how do they come across this information? It's like you've been preyed upon. And then some of our family members told us that we got Indian in our family, but they don't know what type of Indian we have. Again, I'm not taking away the fact that there are those who are Native American mixed. But come on now, you ain't 100% Native American. You is not 100% Native American mixed. You're not. You're not 100%. And that you're not going to try to run that game on me. I mean, I done came across so many debates with folks about this subject matter. I done came across individuals who would swear up and down that slavery never happened. Oh, that's a lie. They told you where the slave ships at. We Moorish, Native American, we all these different stuff. But I want to show you guys something, okay? To tie in about the Afro Native American. So I want to show you a website. And I know you guys are familiar with this one sister. She go by the name of Yonajaha. She go by the name of Yonajaha. So Yonajaha is a Native American mixed with African descent. Okay. So I'm just gonna read a little bit about her. Okay. That's her. So that's Yonajaha. So Yonajaha Lone Wolf Queen Yonajaha is an activist, hip hop artist, and curator of African and Lakota heritage. Yonajaha, pronounced Yonajaha, meaning precious jewel, is an enrolled member of the Golala Lakota nation. No nation can rise higher than its woman, is a saying that breathes through for Queen Yonajaha. As she epitomized this energy, are you of African indigenous descent want to be a part of our documentary film Afro Native narrative? We value your voice and we would love to include you in our documentary. All right. So it says that as an Afro Native American woman is committed to continue the work of her mother, Juanita Lone Wolf Cox. Okay. So there's a film they have which is about the Afro Native American narrative. Let me look that up. As a matter of fact, let me see if I can find it on YouTube. Let me see if I can find Afro Native American YouTube. All right, so I just want to look up something. I just want to show you guys something. Trying to find the video because it's on here. Okay. All right, so I am going to play a video clip, right, about the Black Indian, okay? And so I want to show you what the real Black Indians look like, okay? All right, so there won't be this misconception about we're not African descent and we're just only indigenous and all this other stuff. All right, but let me go ahead and post up that disclaimer before I play this video. Okay. So here's the disclaimer. It says copyright disclaimer. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. For fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay. All right. So with that being said, let's go ahead and play the video. All right, so the YouTube channel is called I Love Ancestry. All right. It's called I Love Ancestry. I'm going to go ahead and play this video clip.
I have covered the topic of Black Indians very often as a Native American journalist and radio show host, and I have found so often a disproportionate amount of understanding for those of white and Indian ancestry and Black and Indian ancestry. For example, if I say, I'm Mohawk and Austrian and German, people very rarely question that I'm Native American. This is not necessarily the case with people of African American descendancy and Native American descendancy. They often get questioned, well, you couldn't be, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a double standard. At a recent powwow, I was lucky to meet up with some friends of mine, Dr. Erica Coleman, who is Rappahannock and African American, and she is the writer of the book That the Blood Stay Pure. She's also a professor of Black Studies at the University of Delaware. Mr. Harold Caldwell is Grovan and Muskogee, and he's a northern traditional dancer who's been all over the country. And both of them have told me on numerous accounts on how they receive criticism for, because they look African American, they couldn't possibly be Native American. So I interviewed them, and they have some very, very interesting comments.
As you can see, I am of African American heritage, and I do have what they call dreadlocks. And a lot of times when I tell people that I am also Native American, they have a real problem. Oh my God, an Indian in dreadlocks. Well, of course, if you understand the history of African American and Native American peoples in this country, we had some things in common. Once the communication barrier was taken care of, the Native people and African peoples realized that there was so much in common culturally. For instance, the drum. The drum is the heartbeat of the nation, of Native Americans and both African peoples. We honor our ancestors. Is shared both between African American and Native American people. This love of nature, no, not a worship of nature, but understanding that we are all connected.
I spent most of my life dancing out in California, out west. Never really had any problems until I came here to Virginia. It is absolutely a struggle. People with their cultural, conflict within themselves. I think you really have to be strong within yourself first in order to walk in this world, especially if you don't quote unquote look Indian. I think that's the first part that has to come first, and then moving forward to try to prove who you are. But there are full bloods that feel like they don't need to have their card. Only cultural group in the country that needs to identify who they are as a culture, and people generally accept you for who you are and they trust you who you are. And I think when you do things the right way, then people know that you're walking in the right way, and they generally believe in what you say.
When we found out that those things were in common, it was very easy for us to begin to fellowship with one another. And as one artist says, he says, first we prayed, then we danced, and then we made relatives.
Okay, that's the video. That's the first video right there. As you can see, you see they talked about the combination of Native American, African ancestry combined together. You see, they ain't just go around just saying that I'm just Native American and I have no African in my blood and I don't deal with being African. No, they claim both part of them. Okay? As a matter of fact, let me pull up another individual. His name is Kyle T. Mays. Let me put up Kyle T. Mays. All right. You know what? Give me a second. All right, give me a few moments. It's gonna take me a few moments to pull up everything. Hold on. All right, I'm back. So I'm gonna play a little clip from Kyle T. May's lecture.
Now, for African Americans, their historical circumstance or people of African descent is through the issue of enslavement, right? And we often hear something like the original sin of the United States was slavery. And I think it's good to see both of these things side by side. It is, of course, enslavement, but it's also the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Their relationship, it's always a tuggle. African Americans constantly trying to get out of this issue of second class citizenship. What was the nation state's goal historically and in many ways today? To segregate or exploit for various reasons. Um, and how people have talked about this is our African Americans are seeking civil rights. And there's a constant discourse around civil rights. And many who try to think globally, a la Malcolm X.
All right, that's Kyle T. Mays. That's his lecture called The Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Okay. Then you can also look up the sister I was telling y'all about earlier. Let me find that sister name again. All right, hold on. All right, peace, brother. Thank you for coming through. Peace, peace, peace. All right, so I want to play this sister. I'm trying to find the interview that she did. Okay, so she did the interview with Hot 97. Matter of fact, now I'll find this video clip right here. Okay, so here's the sister right here. I think, yeah.
Magazine, it says Native Americans are more likely than most other racial groups to be killed by police. Is that true?
Yes, well, because our percentage, our population.
You make up just 0.8% of the
Yes.
population,
Mhm.
and the victims are 1.9% of police killings. Why people don't talk about that more?
Because a lot of people don't even think Native Americans are alive.
That is a fact.
A lot of people don't even, we're out of sight, out of mind. We're out in reservations, concentration camps. We are far away from the city. And they did that they did that purposely because they wanted the African slaves to be close to Massa and the natives to be away.
Is it because y'all, they don't want you to tell your story? Is there anybody in your family, like a grandmother, great grandmother, your mom, God bless the dead, that would tell you the horrors of the genocide they faced?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I was the only girl born during the American Indian Movement longest walk. It was a walk in I'm telling my age, but 1977 to 1978, and from Alcatraz, San Francisco to Washington, D.C. And it was a fight to demand justice and everything that was happening then. And so I grew up in knowing who I am. I was raised into a huge movement, a huge protest.
As you can see, that's the sister. She was giving that clip of the interview where she was talking to Charlamagne the Donkey and DJ Envy and Angela Yee about the Native American culture. But as you can see, she acknowledged that her African descent because her father is African and her late mother was Native American. So she probably went by the tribe that her mother was in. Okay, that's what she identifies with, but she also acknowledged that African part of her. Okay, so let's find the interview that she did with Hot 97. Okay, so I'm gonna go back and put up my disclaimer. Okay. Let me find that disclaimer, guy. Put back on that disclaimer. Okay. So y'all see that disclaimer up. Okay. So the sister did the interview on Hot 97. discussing Native American community and Cop Watch, etc. This was back in 2019.
New York and on the new Hot 97 app. Ebro in the morning on Hot 97.
Ebro in the morning. The beautiful Laura Stiles Rosenberg, my friend Yanaz the Lone Wolf is back on the program. Now I've known you for several years, and we've had you on several times talking about many different things. Even Standing Rock and what went on with the tribes out there. In the Dakotas and the Lakota tribe and all that. Now you have a show on BET, Cop Watch America, which just premiered last week. What's this about?
So Cop Watch America is about police brutality. Of the work I do around police brutality and activism. They've been following a crew from Atlanta as well as New York. It was from a documentary called Cop Watch that was on Netflix. And so they turned into a 10-part docuseries about people of whether they're going around cop watching and for me, I deal with the aftermath after it goes viral. 4 of my cousins in Pine Ridge, South Dakota was murdered by police.
Wow.
8 of my friends have been murdered by police, and 2 of them were their children. And so I deal with this from a personal perspective, and it's really, really great. It's, drama in regards to us and our and what we're dealing with and fighting police terrorism.
Now, people may be watching this interview, and you have a very up spirit. And normally when you see somebody say they've lost 8 friends from any sort of murder, let alone murder at the hands of basically the government, right? And people who are supposed to be out here saving lives, right? You have a very bright spirit, but you're also associated with the Native American, the Indigenous First Peoples, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to get to is unpacking and dealing with trauma and these things have been a part of your entire life.
Yes, it has been. My mother was in prison for 7 years as a political prisoner. I've been homeless. I've been through a lot of stuff, and I would say spirituality is a major thing. We have our ceremonies, which is the Sweat Lodge ceremony, Inipi ceremonies. So I try my best to go home as much as I can to be able to be able to detox, and to and get back. I realize that I have a purpose to heal people, and in that, my mother used to say, when you're giving out joy, you bring it back in. When you're giving out love, you bring that back in. You have to always make sure that you restore yourself back. And so as I'm getting older through wisdom and experience, I always try to make sure I do that.
Now, you reached out to me a few months ago, and we were talking about things that we could do for kids. And, we've been running around in New York with the Peace Mobile and Erica Ford and, showing up, trying to let everyone know that there are spaces, right? Like the Peace Mobile shows up to neighborhoods that have been traumatized with gun violence and dealing with gang issues, where there's this space of people who want to heal you, just like what you were talking about with, putting positive energy into people's lives in any way, shape, or form. And then you and I started talking about some of the things that you're on the front lines of dealing with the tribes in the North and South Dakota area, which are known as the Lakota Tribes.
Yes.
Right?
Lakota, Nakota, Dakota.
Got it. So, and these are the tribes that everyone saw in the mainstream media who were protesting the pipeline at Standing Rock, which was basically ended up getting done because Donald Trump became president. Obama had put a halt to it, but even Obama hadn't all the way shut it down. Am I understanding it correct? It was once the pushback of the people, Obama slowed it down, but didn't stop it. And then Trump came in,
and that was and that was his first order of business. Like right on the first day, he said, let's get these pipelines built. And not only the Dakota Access Pipeline, but also the Keystone. So even though...
And that's Yellowstone National Park, right?
No, Keystone is the oil pipeline from Canada all the way down to the Mississippi, entire Mississippi River. So we are about to prepare for that fight.
And then just for the audience, the biggest fear of those pipelines was the leaking and the damaging, the poisoning of the land, which already happened, correct?
Yes. Well, in one of the pipelines, not that one we was fighting against, but in South Dakota, it did leak. And
what does that mean?
Well, the pipe, when you see you think that an oil pipeline goes underneath. When you physically see an oil pipeline, it's on top.
of the ground.
Of the ground. And then and the way that they build it, it's that crude oil. So they're not building it sturdy. I mean, it's always going to be something. It's going to be a leak because it's above ground.
And it's built in fragments, right?
Yeah,
and so those fragments, they can leak. Obviously, weather issues take place. The seals bust, and the crude oil leaks into the ground.
Into the land, poisoning everything.
That's bad.
Everything. Yeah.
You don't want that. You don't want oil in the ground.
I don't think you want crude oil leaking.
No. And then your water, because you can't, and see, we use Missouri River is attached to 200 rivers. That means that's also, so then imagine the Mississippi River. So it's not just a Native American issue, it's a water issue. It's all of America because we get our water from the rivers. So we really was fighting for our water, and we're about to start fighting for our against the Keystone XL.
Wow. And beyond protest, can you and the people who have indigenous rights to these land and have been recognized by the government, what other than protests can be done?
Petitions, reaching out to their politicians, and not voting for those, and also divestment. Every major bank is investing in these oil pipelines. And as I fought against police brutality, I'm dealing with the police and following and, being antagonized and things like that. But when I was fighting against Standing Rock, against the oil pipelines, that was a whole nother beast because that's investors, that's banks. And that was Tiger Swan, which is a security firm that was hired by Energy Transfer that was basically like Blackwater. And they came in to infiltrate Standing Rock. So we're dealing with a whole nother militia, CIA type of thing. And so divestment, so Bank of America, Wells Fargo, the list goes on.
So when you say a whole other level, you're talking about basically what we see on a global scale where people come in and destabilize communities because then they can.
Okay, so I'm just gonna stop that video right there. So that was the sister that was talking. That was Sister Queen Lonajaha, if I'm saying her name, Queen Yonajaha, that's her name. So she was talking and whatnot, but I want to show you guys something real fast. Okay, let me show you guys something. If you still following me, okay. All right, let's talk about who are Black Indians. Because, see, it seems like people don't know who the Black Indians are. All right. See, when I hear folks claim they're Black Indians, who are they? Do you know who the Black Indians are? Are you just saying it just to be saying that? Do you know who the Black Indians are, or are you saying it just to be saying it? Let's look up the Black Indians. Who were the Black Indians? So Black Indians are Native American people defined as Native American due to being affiliated with Native American communities and being culturally Native Americans who also have significant African American heritage. Check this out. Historically, certain Native American tribes have had close relation with Native Americans, especially in regions where slavery was prevalent and where free people of color have historically resided. Members of the 5 civilized tribes participate in holding enslaved African Americans in Southeast, and some enslaved or formerly enslaved people migrated with them to the west on the Trails of Tears in 1830 and later during the period of Indian removal. And it says, in controversial action, since the late 20th century, the Cherokee Creek Seminole Nation tightened their rules for membership at a time, excluded freemen who did not have at least one ancestor listed as Native American on the early 20th century Dowee rolls. This exclusion was later appealed in the courts, both because of the treaty condition and in some cases because of possible inaccuracies in some of the rolls. The Chickasaw Nation never extended censorship to Chickasaw freemen. Now, here it is. Check this out. Let's go into the overview. Okay. Until recently, historic relations between Native Americans and African Americans were relatively neglected in mainstream United States studies. At various times, Africans had varying degrees of contact with Native Americans. Although they did not live together in as great number as with Europeans, African slaves brought to the United States and their descendants have had a history of cultural exchange and intermarriage with Native Americans, as well as with other enslaved mixed race persons who had some Native American and European ancestry. Most interaction took place in New England, where contact was early, and the southern United States, where the largest number of African descended people were enslaved. And in the 21st century, a significant number of African Americans have some Native American ancestry, but most have not grown up within those cultures and do not have current social, cultural, or linguistic ties to Native Americans. Okay. Now again, do you know anything about the Black Indians? Do anybody know anything about the Black Indians? So the people that profess that they are indigenous, do you know who the Black Indians were? I just gave you an example of those who are a descendant of those who were considered Black Indians. I just showed you the sister. I just showed you a video clip, and then I showed you Kyle T. Mays, who is a part Indian African descendant. I just showed you these videos. Now let's go further down. Okay, let's go further down. It says most interaction took place in New England, where contact was early, and the southern United States, where the largest number of African descended people were enslaved. In the 21st century, a significant number of African Americans have some Native American ancestry. But most have not grown up with those cultures and do not have current social, cultural, or linguistic ties to Native peoples. Relationship among different Native Americans, Africans, and African Americans have been varied and complex. Some tribes or bands were more accepting of ethnic Africans than others, and welcomed them as full members of their respective cultures and communities. Native peoples often disagree about the role of ethnic African people in their communities. Other Native Americans saw use for slavery and did not oppose it for others. Some Native Americans and people of African descent fought alongside one another in armed struggles or resisted against U.S. expansion into Native territories, as in the Seminole Wars in Florida. Okay? After the American Civil War, some African Americans became or continue as members of the U.S. Army. Many were assigned to fight against Native Americans in the wars in the Western frontier states. Their military units became known as the Buffalo Soldier, a nickname given by Native Americans. Black Seminole men in particular were recruited from Indian Territory to work as Native American scouts for the Army. Okay? And then you can see it goes down into the history about the European colonizing Americas. All right, as you can see, this is a picture of a woman who happens to be a Black Seminole. Okay, her name is Diana Fletcher. Diana Fletcher, a Black Seminole. All right. Okay, so it says historian Carter G. Woodson believed that relation with Native American tribes could have provided an escape hatch from slavery. Native American villages welcomed fugitive slaves, and in the antebellum years, some served as stations on the Underground Railroad. There were varieties of attitudes. Some Native Americans resent resented the presence of Africans. In one account, the Catawba tribe in 1752 showed great anger and bitter resentment when an African American came along among them as a trader. European and European American colonists tried to divide Native Americans and African Americans against each other. Europeans considered both races inferior and tried to convince Native Americans that Africans worked against their best interests. In the colonial period, Native Americans received rewards if they returned escaped slaves. In the latter 19th century, African American soldiers had assignments to fight with U.S. forces in Indian wars in the West. Okay, then talk about European enslavement, right? As a matter of fact, let's read on just a little bit. Okay, so it says European colonists created a demand market for captives of raids when they founded what would go on to become the 13 colonies, especially in the southern colonies, initially developed for resource exploitation rather than settlement. Colonists purchased or captured Native Americans to be used as forced labor in cultivating tobacco, and by the 18th century, rice and indigo. All right. To acquire trades good, Native Americans began selling war captives to whites rather than integrating them into their own society. Traded goods such as axes, bronze kennels, Caribbean rum, European jewelry, needles, and scissors varied among the tribes, but the most prized were rifles. The English copied the Spanish and Portuguese. They saw the enslavement of Africans and Native Americans as a moral, legal, and socially acceptable institution. A rationale for enslavement was just war, taking captives and using slavery as an alternative to a death sentence. All right, then it goes on to say the escape of Native American slaves were frequent because they had a better understanding of the land, which African slaves did not. Consequently, the natives who were captured and sold into slavery were often sent to West Indies or far away from their traditional homeland. All right, so that's the Native American slavery. That's just the one piece that I'm reading to you. Okay, you can find more information. Just look up Black Indians on Wikipedia. Okay, now right here what says Native American slave ownership. Check this out. Check this out. Again, and I'm talking to the indigenous people out there because y'all keep talking that indigenous stuff. But do you really know what it means to be a Black Indian? Slavery had existed amongst Native Americans as a way to make use of war captives before it was introduced by the Europeans. It was not the same as the European style of chattel slavery in which slaves were counted as the personal property of a master. In Cherokee oral tradition, they enslaved war captives and was temporary status pending adoption into a family or clan or release. As the United States Constitution and the laws of several states permitted slavery after the American Revolution, while northern states prohibited, Native Americans were legally allowed to own slaves, including those brought from Africa by Europeans. In the 1790s, Benjamin Hawkins was the federal agent assigned to the southeastern tribes, promoting assimilation to European American Moors. He advised the tribes to take up slave holding so that they could undertake farming and plantation as did other Americans. The Cherokee tribe had the most members who held Black slaves more than any other Native American nation. And it's funny because I have heard a lot of Black folks claim to be Cherokee Indians. So you claiming to be Cherokee Indian, but did you know that the Cherokee people held the most Black slaves? Do you know that? Are you aware of that? I don't think so. Let's continue. All right, it says, records from the slavery period show several cases of brutal Native American treatment of Black slaves. However, most Native Americans' masters reject the worst features of Southern practices. Federal agent Hawkins considered the form of slavery as a practice by the Southern tribes to be inefficient because the majority didn't practice chattel slavery. Travelers reported enslaved Africans in as a good circumstances as their masters. A white Indian agent, Douglas Cooper, upset by the Native American failure to practice more severe rules, insisted that Native Americans invite white men to live in their village and control matters. Okay? Check this out. Though less than 3% of Native Americans owned slaves, the fact of a racial caste system and bondage and pressure from European American culture created destructive cleavages in their villages. Some already had a class hierarchy based on white blood, in part because Native Americans of mixed race sometimes had stronger networks with traders for goods they wanted. Among some bands, Native Americans of mixed white blood stood at the top, pure Native Americans next, and people of African descent were at the bottom. People of African descent were at the bottom. Okay? Some of the status of partial white descent may have been related to economic and social capital passed on by white relation. Members of Native groups held numerous African American slaves through the Civil War. Some of these slaves later recounted their lives for a WPA oral history project during the Great Depression in 1930s. All right. So again, do you know what that means to be a Black Indian? Do you know anything about the history of the Black Indians? Do you know who the Black Indians were to you indigenous people out there? I just read it to you. The Black Indians were people of African descent. Okay? No way you're going to see that the Black Indians were just totally Native American, dark-skinned looking people. No. They were African descended people who had some native mixed in them, or they had relation with the Native American culture. Okay? Native American freedmen. Now, should I go ahead and read on to this? Now, let's look at genealogy and genetics. Let's look under that. Okay, let's look under that for a moment, because I'm going to skip that. All right, so as you can see, this picture right here is a Black man. Okay, his name is George Bonga. George Bonga. That's George Bonga. Oops. An African-American and Ojibwe fur trader. So I may do him tomorrow, okay? Since we on this subject about the Black Indians. African-American and Ojibwe fur trader. All right. Okay, and as you can see, these are a picture. All right, and an unidentified girl of African American descent, which is this little girl right here. So these are Native Americans, and this is the unidentified African American girl. All right, so here it is. Check this out. African Americans looking to trace their genealogy can find many difficulties, while a number of Native Americans nation are better documented than white communities of the era. The destruction of the family ties and family records during the human trafficking of the Atlantic slave trade has made tracking African American family lines much more difficult. In Black Indian, a hidden heritage, William Katz writes that the number of Black Indians among the Native American nation were understated by hundreds of thousands, and that by comparing pictorial documentation to verbal and written accounts, it is clear that when Black Indians were spotted in these settings, they were often simply not remarked upon or recorded by white chroniclers of the era. Now check this out. Enslaved Africans were renamed by those who enslaved them and usually not even recorded with surnames until after the American Civil War. Historical records usually relied upon by genealogists such as census did not record the names of enslaved African Americans. Before the Civil War, while some major slavers kept extensive record which historians and genealogists have used to create family tree, generally researchers find it difficult to trace African American families before the Civil War. Enslaved people were also forbidden to learn to read and write, and harshly punished or even killed if they defied this ban, making records kept by families themselves extremely rare. All right. So it is hard most of the time to trace the Native American roots to the African roots because there was information that has been destroyed. Okay. Now let's look at the elder family members. So it says, elder family members have tried to keep an oral history of the family, but due to these many difficulties, these accounts have not always been as reliable as hoped for. Knowing the family's geographic origins may help individuals know where to start in piecing together their genealogy. Working from oral history, what record exists, descendants can try to confirm stories of more precise African origins and any possible Native ancestry through genealogical research and even DNA testing. However, DNA cannot reliably indicate Native American ancestry, and no DNA test can indicate tribal origins. All right. DNA testing research have provided some data about the extent of Native American ancestry among African Americans, which varies in the general population. Based on the work of geneticist, Harvard University historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. hosted a popular and at times controversial PBS series, African American Lives, in which geneticists said DNA evidence showed that Native American ancestry is far less common among African Americans than previously believed. Okay. Then it goes on to say their conclusion were that while almost all African Americans are racially mixed and many have family stories of native heritage, usually these stories turn out to be inaccurate. Only 5% of African American people showing more than 2% Native American ancestry. Gates summarized these statistics to mean that if you have 2% Native American ancestry, you have one such ancestor in your family tree 5 to 9 generations back, which is 150 to 270 years ago. Their findings also conclude that the most common non-Black mix among African Americans is English and Scotch-Irish. Some critics thought the PBS series did not sufficiently explain the limitation of DNA testing for assessment of heritage. All right. So that means that not everybody who walk around here claiming to be indigenous got Indian in them. Everybody all you indigenous folks out there talking about you got Indian in your family. It's not 9 times out of 10 you don't. 9 times out of 10 you don't. Some of you do, but half of y'all don't. Half of y'all ain't got no Indian in your family like you think. And that's a fact. Okay? So now, the question I ask again, what is the fascination about being Native American? What is your fascination? Why do you have a hard time accepting your African heritage? Why do you, as a person who identifies as being indigenous, have a hard time accepting your African heritage? I seen somebody on Facebook one day talking about they don't identify with the African booty scratchers. Someone came on Facebook and said they don't identify with them African folks. They not those people. They not the African booty scratchers. Which I thought that was very condescending and highly disrespectful. Until then, you are what you are. You can't change that. Okay? My thing is, if you're going to identify with being European American, white American at that, or if you're going to identify with being Native American, why don't you identify with your African heritage? And as the sister mentioned in one of the videos, she said that the Native American culture is very similar to the African culture. The Native American culture is very similar to the Native American culture. So why is that you just want to jump on the Native American bandwagon? For those of you who are indigenous, why are you just jumping on Native American bandwagon? Huh? And again, do you know what Black Indian people are? Black Indians are African descendant people who have Native American blood. So if you say you Black Indian, that means that you got African descent in you and you got Native American in you, period, point blank. Nothing more, nothing less. So if you identify as Black Indigenous, Native American in you, African descent. All right. So with that being said, that's all I have for today. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and log off here. This is your girl, Tiffany. And I'm saying peace and power elevation. And I will catch up with you guys later. All right. Deuces. Y'all have a good one. All right. Oh, by the way, make sure you subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, and share my channel, okay? Do that. So I said what I need to say for today. I hope everybody have a good one. Peace.